So welcome everyone. I think you're all piling into this commercial law student discussion forum now. Some of you will know me because I will have taught you. My name is Jennifer Hill and I'm the Bob Baxt AO Chair of Corporate and Commercial Law at Monash Law School, and I'm Director of CLARS, the Centre for Commercial Law and Regulatory Studies, which hosts these student events. And our event today is a very special one. We have as our speaker, Yu Zhang. I have known Yu for many, many years. He has been a great colleague in the past and friend. He's Managing Associate in the Banking and Finance Law Practice Group at Allens. Yu was a student at University of Sydney who subsequently went on to complete his Master of Laws at Cambridge University in the UK, focusing on private law, and then, as if that wasn't enough, went on to do a Master of Laws at Harvard University, where he concentrated on corporate governance and financial regulation, and that has propelled him to the path that he's taken today. So Yu has very kindly consented to come along and talk to all of you budding financial and banking lawyers. And I'm going to pass over to him. He's going to talk for around 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for the students to ask questions and, you know, just find out what life is really like. Yu, thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very honoured to be here today and speaking to you as part of the Commercial Law Student Discussion Forum. I think it's a terrific initiative, and indeed, I have to say, I feel very underqualified to be here, all the more so when I discovered that the last speaker was the former Chief Justice of Victoria. So I'm afraid you'll have to brace yourself for a significant come down today. So thanks very much all for tuning in. I'm pretty humbled that you've chosen to give up your lunch times to listen to someone who, as you'll see when I start to share with you some of my past experiences, who's really had more luck than talent. And I know what precious time lunchtime is, particularly when you are at university, and especially when there's no free lunch being offered, as we can't during these times. Now, every year when I speak to our summer clerk candidates, who no doubt many of you are thinking about at the moment, and the same kind of questions come up about what it's like to work at a corporate law firm in general and to work as a banking finance lawyer in particular. They're questions like, is it really soulless and boring? What is banking law? Because I'm pretty sure it wasn't a thing at uni. And is every day for you just like being a main character in Game of Thrones? You never know when you're going to be killed off. Well, it occurred to me that as uni students, and I include myself in that category at the time, we don't really know a lot about, if anything, about being a banking finance lawyer. So today I thought I'd come and have a chat to you about first, how I became a banking and finance lawyer. Secondly, what is banking and finance law? And third and finally, what it's like to be a banking finance lawyer. Now, I like to keep this as casual and as much of a chat as possible. We have only, looks like 40 odd participants at the moment. So feel free, if you have any questions, to jump in at any time, and there'll be plenty of time at the end as well. Or put your hand up either physically or using the little Zoom icon, and we can have a chat about whatever question that may be on your mind. So first I might start about how I became a banking lawyer. But before I do that, Ellie has very helpfully put up a question, or will be putting up a question shortly. Here's a poll that I want to see from all of you. Who's absolutely sure that they want to be a banking finance lawyer? And Ellie's currently giving you a few possibilities there. So you can choose between definitely, probably, maybe, or convince me.
Just give it a couple of seconds. We've got most people have filled it out, just a couple to go, and then I'll let you know who the results. Okay, a couple more, and then I'm going to end polling. So let's see.
Okay, it looks like the vast majority of people are either maybes or convince me's. I think the folks who said maybe were probably the politest folks in the room. The ones who said probably are even more polite than they are, and the ones who answered definitely, I'm afraid I don't believe you. and those who said convince me, you would be in the same category as I was, because I have an admission to make up front, and that is I never wanted to be a banking finance lawyer. So how did I get here? Well, my story is really one about discovery and working things out as I go along with a huge, as I say, bolt of fortune along the way. I think if I had to look back and boil it down to a couple of things, it would be to, it all came down to the fact that I kept an open mind and a pretty adventurous spirit. And that, I think, is, if you take away nothing else, is something that I highly encourage you to have and keep throughout your years at university and even as you go out into the workforce. So, as I said, the idea of being a corporate lawyer, let alone a banking lawyer, was not an ambition that I always had. Far from it. In fact, the very first time I ever had an interaction with corporate law was when I took the course as a mandatory unit in my second last year of undergrad law. And Jennifer and I were just reminiscing about this before we opened the seminar to all of you, because that course was taught by a team which was led by Professor Jennifer Hill. And I had a young lecturer called Andrew Tuck, who had just returned from studying at the Harvard Law School and working in the US at a US firm. Now, for those of you who attended the class seminar on managing management buyouts last year, you would have heard from the now Professor Andrew Tuck of Washington University. Now, I have to say that thinking back at the start of that semester, I was a bit concerned about what my experience would be like in that course. I was painfully aware that, unlike many of my friends, I was a complete noob in the commercial world. And unlike my friends studying commerce law, I had always assumed that I had no interest in that world whatsoever. But as it turned out, I had a terrific experience in that unit. The teaching didn't assume that we had any background in the field at all. It gave a very clear structure for how to approach the subject and provided really clear and simple explanations for everything. Now, to my surprise, most of all, I think, I discovered that this area of the law, and in fact, this world, wasn't really, in fact, it wasn't just about big companies doing things that mattered to very few. It was a world that was actually quite rich with stories from selfless heroes to shady characters. And for those of you who've taken Jennifer's course in corporate law, you will know exactly what I mean. So you can see we share the same academic experience, and given that today's session is hosted by class, you have clearly come to commercial law a lot more quickly than I did. Now, that experience at law school, eye-opening though it wasn't really, I think, enough to convince me that I wanted to work in a commercial law firm. My interests at the time were pretty divided. On the one hand, I was very much interested in international human rights law because it seemed like a really cool international jet-setting career that at the same time allowed you to help people. On the other hand, I really enjoy the intellectual rigor and the more developed private law subjects like equity, contracts, and corporations law. So what I did was to decide to explore both of those things further. Now, in aid of the former, I decided to go on exchange to the Netherlands and spent a wonderful half a year there where I took a number of international law subjects and enjoyed Jessup mooting. And I was lucky enough, because I was located there, to see how a few international organizations located in and around the Netherlands actually worked from the inside out. In aid of the latter, I applied for a summer clerkship at Allens, and I was pretty lucky that the partners decided to clearly overlook some of my deficiencies and give me a job. And that turned out to be an absolute eye-opener for me. It was the very first time that I think law became a real thing for me. Before that, without realizing it, I think the law was largely theoretical for me and in my mind. Parties from cases were almost like characters from a very serious Russian novel. They only existed for the purpose of illustrating the precise legal principle for which I was reading that case. I never really thought about the broader questions, like what are the wider consequences of a legal decision? How did the parties even get themselves into that position in the first place? And could something have been done? to avoid them being in that position at all. That experience early on at Allen's made it all very real for me. And as I started to get to know the clients of the firm better, I realized that they and their colleagues were actually going to bear the full brunt and the wider consequences of any decision that was being undertaken and any advice that was given to them. And they're looking for you, most of all, for support and guidance during that time. And that I found to be an incredibly personal relationship as a result, but also an incredibly challenging and exciting one, because you had the opportunity to do something really that was, I thought, very worthwhile. And that was the first time that tweaked for me. And that real world experience really fascinated me. So I applied for a position to work at the courts so that I can observe the making of law a bit more closely. I was pretty fortunate that in my interview with the late Justice Hodgson, we hit it off really, really well. And so I ended up working for his honour on the New South Wales Court of Appeal for a year as a tipstaff. And again, that experience was a terrific one. It further underlined for me the real importance of thinking about the broader context of each scenario beyond, just the legal principles that were on the page. You really need to think of, and you really need to think about the broader consequences of what would happen to parties, both before actually and also after the decisions being made. Also, was fortunate that I met a lot of very kind people, not least more my judge at the courts, and all of them encouraged me to continue to foster my interest in the law, and to the extent that I didn't know about something, not to rely on what I had heard about it, but rather to discover it for myself instead. And as you can see, this is sort of part of the theme of, one of the key messages I wanted to pass on to you and to encourage all of you to try to undertake. So the next part of where I progressed from there was I felt the next logical step would be to undertake some further studies and build on the areas of interest that I had found in my undergrad studies. I was weighing up whether to do this immediately after I'd finished my year at the courts or after a few years of practice. And I think I was probably veering towards the latter. But it was really my friends who were also working at the courts with me that pushed my decision to try to apply for a further studies position immediately. There used to be a tradition with tippies at the New South Wales Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, and also the Federal Court, which in Sydney is housed in the same building, that every Friday all the court tipstaves and associates would meet up for a drink across the road from the courts. And I remember about halfway through that year, a number of my friends stopped turning up. And so we asked them, where are you? And they all kept on saying that they needed the time to work on their master's applications. We, of course, tried to persuade them that the applications would read much better if they had a beer or two first, but they were pretty adamant that that wasn't the case. So having failed in my attempt to get them to come out with us, I decided to join them and see what it was that they were actually doing. So out of interest, I had a look at a couple of applications to find out just really how intense that process would be, because these friends of mine seemed to be spending sort of 2 or 3 weeks on end working on them. And what I found was that the application process varied a lot from university to university. Without exception, though, all of them were pretty complicated, and they needed you to put together a lot of information about yourself, from personal information about the kind of experience that you had, the kind of studies you'd had, the kind of research and also practical interest that you had. But the hardest applications I read, I think, were the ones that required what was called a personal statement. And from memory, that tended to be the case with a lot of the US universities. They required a personal statement. It was certainly the case with the one from Harvard University. Now, for those of you who haven't come across it before, because in Australia we really don't have them, particularly at the undergraduate level, a personal statement is essentially you're telling your story about, first of all, what has brought you to the point of applying. Secondly, about why it was that you wanted to do this master's program. And thirdly, and for me at that time, most distressingly, how you wanted to use what you'd learned from the master's program to contribute to society after completing it. Now, that last part was most distressing for me, not because it was something that was foreign. It was distressing for me precisely because it was something that I knew was very central to how I would view and judge the worthwhileness of any profession that I chose or any endeavor that I chose. And I hadn't made up my mind as to how I wanted to apply myself and what area I wanted to apply myself. So you can see that whole process asks you to answer some pretty weighty questions. And so, you know, we certainly could pardon our friends for not turning up to Friday night drinks for a couple of weeks, but because you certainly couldn't give any off-the-cuff answers to them. And I had to admit, you know, they were much harder to figure out those answers probably after a couple of beers. So that process was actually good for me, because even though it was so hard and so tough, I think at that time it was exactly what I needed. Something to force me to think about this question that had been concerning me for so long, which is what I would find meaningful. And before deciding the answer to that question, I decided to give myself permission to change my mind later on if circumstances or experiences took me elsewhere. But because I would have an answer in the first place, at least I'd have a base to work from and to depart from if I were to depart from it at all. Now, as I say, that turned out to be one of the most difficult and I think painful experiences that I think I had to go through, as all, you know, what I call growing up experiences are. And at the same time, it was probably one of the most helpful exercises I've ever done, because it was at that point that I worked out that I wanted to pursue corporate and commercial law. And more importantly, I worked out why I wanted to do it. And I'll share with you those reasons in a moment. Because of that experience, I highly recommend people to go through that kind of process, even if they're not thinking about applying for a master's degree, or even if they are doing so but not filling out an application that requires them to set one out. It's sort of not a plan, but it's an opportunity for you to get your own thoughts in order, to say to yourself, this is what I really think is worthwhile. It's really enjoyable for me. And this is where I want to channel all my energy and time. So as Jennifer mentioned, I was very lucky to be accepted by Cambridge and Harvard universities. And although they both offered a Master's of Law degree, the programs are actually quite different. And the reason why I applied for each of them in the first place is that I was attracted by each of them, but in very different ways, by different features of each of them. So the Cambridge Master's degree offers you a really, really solid grounding in private law and gave you an opportunity to examine how these principles worked and how they might develop. That appealed to my interest predominantly in private law. That said, I also ended up doing a fair bit of corporate governance there because there was quite a famous professor who was there at the time, and I think he's still there, teaching corporate governance, and that was also something I was interested in. Now, on the other hand, the Harvard Master's degree program offers a much broader education, inviting you to think about, and I say this not flippantly at all, but pretty much anything but the law. So my time there, I spent, and Jennifer, you appreciate this, having been there, you know, taught yourself there, that it was all about things like politics. It was about things like economics. It was about negotiation strategies. It was about all the broader context in which the law lives. Now, I won't bore you all to death by explaining sort of that there's an academic reason for that, that the revolution in the 1950s towards legal realism in the United States meant that law schools trended more towards those things rather than traditional English universities and their focus on doctrine and issues of principle. For my part, as I say, I was incredibly fascinated by both those different educations. And so I ended up doing both of them. And I think as a result, I ended up receiving two very different sets of educations and sets of opportunities as a result. Now, by the end of my studies, I made a decision then to return to Australia and to Allen's to continue practicing banking finance law. I started for about a year there before going off to study. And as I said, I'll share with you the reasons as to why I did so. And there were really two main reasons for doing so. The first is that I found it incredibly purposeful. And the second reason was that I found it quite intellectually exciting. So the purposeful reason is one that took me a little while to figure out. So my time in the UK and the US studying there coincided with the height of the global financial crisis. I suspect all of you will be too young to remember it with any great detail. But for those of you who have studied that or who have seen the movie The Big Short, the GFC really started with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, a global investment bank based largely out of New York, but with offices all around the world. Now, I arrived in London the day after Lehman Brothers collapsed. In fact, I have a photo that a friend took of me holding up, a pound note or something like that, pretending I was buying Lehman Brothers outside their offices. Now, during that time, it was a very, very difficult time for people in those major financial centers. A lot of people lost their jobs, their homes, and very tragically, some people lost their lives as well in that time. And it made me realize that financial crises have a huge impact on everyone in society, not just the rich or the poor, but everyone. It may be disproportionate, but what we take so much for granted on a day-to-day basis of a efficient and working economy is something that we shouldn't. And so I looked into this a bit further, and academics examined all sorts of reasons as being the causes of the GFC. And one of those things that I studied during my master's at Harvard was the impact of culture. And I think one of the reasons why Australia actually stood up relatively well during the GFC at the time was that we actually had a pretty robust culture, and probably more robust one than others. Now, amongst all this, there's a body of literature about the important role that gatekeepers, like lawyers, play in setting and ensuring the continued healthiness of that corporate culture. When I looked at that rang bells for me about my experiences at Allens, where I realized, even as a junior lawyer, that I was working really pretty much as of day one with some of the very senior people at some of Australia's biggest companies. And not only that I was in contact with them, but it was really clear that the relationship had developed, not between me as someone new to the team, but the people who had been in the team for years, that there was a strong relationship between these clients and their lawyers, that they really trusted their lawyers. And the best lawyers, I felt, had a huge impact on how their clients viewed issues and also how they went about doing things. And I was also fortunate, coupled with that in the short time that I'd spent at Allens, I had come across what I consider to be great role models, both as people and as lawyers. And one of the first lessons I'd been taught, I remember, by one of the senior partners, was to do things the right way and to advise your clients also to do things the right way. Not just because that's what the law required, but also almost always it's so much more in the client's best interests in the long run for them to act in that way. And it's in many ways our job to be able to articulate, the benefits of acting in ways like that, to be an advocate and to guide our clients in the best possible way for themselves. So for me, that gave all of a sudden great meaning, a much deeper meaning to the one that I had thought previously about the work that people did in a corporate law firm, but particularly I felt in the banking finance group, which had been my only experience thus far. Your ability to influence and your ability to ensure that culture continues is a really important one. The second reason why I ended up becoming a banking finance lawyer, as I say, is because I found it intellectually exciting, that it combined the best elements of deal making with application of legal knowledge. So some areas of law require primarily a knowledge of the markets and the ability to negotiate a deal, whereas other areas require primarily a knowledge of the black letter law. the best banking finance lawyers have to be able to do both and at the same time. And the reason for that is that it's a transactional based area of practice that is helping two or more parties to negotiate the terms on which they're going to cooperate in some way. And also because banking finance law has had a long history and this long established principles about so many provisions which directly feed into the banking finance documents that you negotiate. So knowing the law without being practical, or what in the industry lingo is called being commercial, isn't very helpful. But going by gut instinct alone without knowing what the law is that underpins that is incredibly dangerous, because you're essentially not actually sure that you're giving the right advice and you're playing unnecessary Russian roulette. So those are the sort of reasons that led me to where I got to. Now, I'll briefly touch on what is banking finance law to give you an idea of what it is that I do. At its core, it's basically about helping people to borrow and lend money. The exact circumstances of borrowing may differ. Now, that sounds really boring, but the most exciting part of it, I think, is the ability to structure the deal and to use your legal advice to create something new and useful. I'll give you a couple of examples, one from the very beginning of my practice, one from something that I did last year. So an example of something I did, one of my first deals was to bid on the financing of a comprehensive cancer hospital research facility. This is what's called project finance in the industry. So where you are essentially looking to help people lend money towards the building and construction of a major project. And this was made even more complicated by the fact that the Victorian state government was involved and was a party to it. Okay, these kind of projects are called PPPs, or public-private partnerships. Now, that was an incredible entry into the deep end of banking finance law, because it is tough work. But after many years later, after the deal closed, incredibly proud when the VCCC, the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre, opened in Parkville in the north part of Melbourne about 5 years ago now. And does terrific work, acting as a centralised hub for cancer research and creating cancer cures and treatments and conducting education in relation to cancer. So that's an example of some of the a typical type of deal that you might be able to do in banking finance. The other example to highlight at the other extreme end of the scale was something that I did in March last year when COVID first hit. And that was the stimulus response plan by the federal government. Some of you may remember that the first part of that response plan was for the Reserve Bank to lend money to the banks themselves based on how much the banks were in turn lending to their customers. So the banks were incentivized, in other words, to lend as much as possible to keep the economy stimulated. And I was very fortunate to have acted for the RBA in relation to that term funding facility. So we got a heads up that this was going to be announced about 2 weeks before it was actually announced. And during those 2 weeks was basically our lead up to try to get it done as soon as we can, because we wanted to be in effect and operational as soon as the announcement had been made, and that all transitioned very smoothly. So we're also very proud of that. Now, finally, I wanted to say a few words about what it's like living life as a banking finance lawyer. That may sound slightly paradoxical to some of you, but I assure you that's not necessarily the case. And of course, as I say, during question time, I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have about it. The first thing I want to mention is that as a banking finance lawyer, life is quite different to the life you might lead, for example, as a disputes lawyer. And the reason for that is more often than not, in fact, almost always, you are working with parties on the other side and lawyers on the other side towards a common goal, rather than, it's not straight out an opposition or antagonistic relationship that you have. And our ethos has always been to try to be as helpful and cooperative wherever possible. And the reason for that is not just out of professional courtesy, because it's deeply motivated actually by ethical and reasons that we have as lawyers, or to act in the best interest of our client. Because the duty to your client means that you need to help them build a really positive relationship with their counterparty. So in my field of work, where we say negotiate a loan agreement, for instance, just because I'm acting for the bank doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship stops when the loan agreement is signed. The loan agreement may go for 3, 5, 10, 25 years, and the borrower and the lender have to learn to live with each other for that period of time. So if anything, our job really is to make sure that the relationship gets off on a good footing, that both parties are, of course, protected, but that there is a solid foundation from to base the rest of their relationship off and to live that relationship out. And that's a win from our perspective. And so as a result, you do get to know others in the industry very well. And by and large, it's a very courteous and professional, and also most importantly, cooperative environment that you work in, where there's common shared problem solving more than there is dispute about how to divvy up a pie that's not going to grow any larger. The second thing that I want to mention when it comes to what life is like as a banking finance lawyer is very much that the structure of the environment that you're in. And what I mean by that is that you have to remember most firms have internal divisions, and larger firms can have many, many practice groups. They're not all of the same size, and it's not all of the same internal structure, even within each of those internal divisions. The key distinctions and points of difference for me are, as I've already mentioned, between transactional practice groups and disputes, and obviously banking finance falls in the transactional side of things. But there's also the siloed versus non-siloed approach. In a siloed environment, lawyers tend to work for only one partner and as part of a single team. Whereas with a non-siloed approach, lawyers tend to work across the entirety of the practice group, giving them much broader exposure to different types of experiences. Now, I've always been incredibly attracted to Allen's because, certainly in banking finance, but in pretty much every other practice group as well, we operate on a non-siloed basis. That doesn't mean, I think, that there are not great advantages to having a siloed approach, including potentially more individual attention that you might get from the individual partner. But I've always been attracted by the non-siloed approach because it exposes you to such a huge variety of different types of work and gives you almost a bit of a license to choose your own adventure. A quick word on the workload, because that's something that I always get questions about. I think the short answer about how much work there is in a banking finance department is that the hours tend to follow the transaction. And so there may be a cycle between peaks and troughs. I remember, and it really depends on the environment that you're working in, but I feel a good environment and quite a modern environment is one which is flexible and which is adaptable. I remember one of the first years that I worked at Allen's, I had a tough transaction that I worked on and completed. And the next day I was sitting at my office and working on something just after lunch when the practice group leader happened to walk by and said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, I work here, I think, thinking that, this is a conversation that I'm about to be fired. What have I done? And she said to me, "No, it's just, didn't you just finish that deal yesterday?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, what are you doing here, you loser? Shouldn't you be at the beach? Have a good time and, refresh yourself. And we know when the work is on, you need to come back to it." So, that kind of ability to being adaptable and flexible and to be appropriate really around, what's manageable for the lawyers, is an environment that certainly exists. I'm not saying that necessarily happens everywhere. It's a very team by team thing and a firm by firm environment, firm by firm kind of thing. So, but I think most law firms, I think it's fair to say, are transitioning towards that much more flexible approach. And quite frankly, part of it was that they had to, particularly given the events of last year and the difficulties we had. Some firms transition a lot more easily, but I think all firms make great strides in that direction. The final thing I wanted to mention was actually education. You might think that once you get started working, that education has stopped because education is the domain of university, and only people like myself who didn't know better decided to do further degrees, and no doubt many of you are looking forward to finishing your degree and going out into the workforce. What I will say is that actually working at a law firm, a significant portion of your time is taken up with education. As a graduate, many firms have a formal educational program. I know personally at Allen's, and particularly in the banking finance group, I was very fortunate to receive training for a whole year, which was the equivalent of doing a master's course in finance law. And I know that because some of the partners who taught me actually taught the Masters of Finance Law course at Sydney University at some point. And I was fortunate also because these partners who taught me were themselves taught by Justices Gummo and Lehane and the like, who were senior partners at the firm at the time. And so I was lucky enough to be the recipient of that tradition, which is passed on from generation to generation. And that learning doesn't stop when you become more senior. Financial systems and markets are constantly adapting, and this is not new, they've been doing this for hundreds of years. There are entire lines of jurisprudence that date back to the medieval times that result directly as a response to new creations of transactional, and particularly, might I say, finance lawyers, because they've been involved in adapting to those changes in the financial markets. And in a largely virtuous cycle, that growth of the markets has fueled further growth in our society. So to be a good banking finance lawyer, you need to be on top of all those changes and really ahead of those changes in order to be a good lawyer and serving your clients properly. So this process that I've just mentioned, in fact, any of the processes that I just mentioned isn't all that different to what you're doing now at university. Although, as I say, no doubt many of you can't wait to finish. The habits that you've formed and the ways of thinking that you've learnt will form a really strong foundation in your careers and the rest of your lives. So I hope that what I've provided today is a little insight into what it's like being a banking finance lawyer, and that what I've shared with you might make you feel that even with nothing else, keeping an open mind and adventurous spirit could take you a long way to doing something which is fun, meaningful, and potentially rewarding for you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, you. I should tell the students I've been trying to get this man to become an academic for years, but I lost him to the world of banking and finance at Allen's, and it's wonderful to hear, how you work there. And I think one of the things I found quite fascinating was you stressing that a lot of what you do is cooperative work to work for the common goal, because so much of what we teach at corporate law is after everything goes pear-shaped, when, parties are at one another's throats. So it's really valuable to realise that, when you're there putting the deal together, that is not what is happening. It's not a Donald Trump type situation where it's, winner take all. Now we're going to open up for student questions. Ellie, how will I know when these questions come through? Because I can't see questions on the screen. Do you see them, or I'm not quite sure how I'm going to...
I can keep an eye out, Jennifer.
Okay, well...
So if anyone wants to put their physical or virtual hand up and just come off camera, then...
Because I know you is happy to, talk to you about whatever he's mentioned, and probably other things as well.
So
just while we're waiting for them to... Any yet, Ellie?
Yep, Hanlu has a question.
Hanlu, thanks, Han.
Hey guys, sorry, your name is Yu, is it? Hi.
Yeah, that's right, Han.
Hi, it's really nice. Thank you for sharing the really insightful experience and knowledge. Sorry, my mom is cooking. I better go to my room. So you see the Zoom and lockdown doesn't work for everybody, not for me. But anyway,
that's okay, Han. I was quite enjoying the minions in your background there.
It's my sister's toys. I share the apartment with mom and sister. But anyway, so I personally hold a Master of Banking and Finance at Monash as well. So I'm the Monash guy. So does my sister. She goes to Monash as well with my influence. Unfortunately, I haven't got the experience like you with Harvard and Cambridge. I just, but anyway, I speak other languages, and I try to, my grades at first were not as high as I hoped, but I later picked up. What sort of, so what do you think, like for people like me, like who has a background in banking and finance, who is hesitant, but I don't know whether I should go to banking and finance, but I think I will have a clear advantage having another master. And my dad was an investment banker, and I speak, Chinese and English, so I clearly have an advantage. So I'm thinking to apply as well to my doc and Minja and Alison, I think. Yeah, Minja and I can't remember the name. Sorry. So what do you think the sort of things I should put on my CV, and how do I make sure I stand out in the interview? Yeah. So and sort of I guess conceal my deficiency, my flaws. Yeah. What kind of advice can you give to me?
Thanks for your question, Han. And I think you needn't be nervous about it. I think most people, when we're applying for our first job or even second job, think about that. I think the short answer for me has always been be as honest and upfront as you can about what it is that drives you to want to be a banking finance lawyer. And if you have a good answer to that, it's always incredibly impressive and authentic to hear it. And if you think about it from the perspective of, any of the law firms as a potential employer, it's nice to have someone in the team who is authentic, who is genuine, who is talented and hardworking. And that's pretty much, what they're looking for, right? So if you genuinely have an interest in the area, make sure you articulate that interest would be the tip that I give you. And explain why it is that you have that interest, because, that will make people realize that you're genuine about it.
Yeah, I might have to think about the answer because it's not an easy answer. Why do I want to become banking lawyer? But I think it's just part of me. Like lawyer, being a lawyer is part of me. Maybe having professional parents, but maybe something like that. And to have I do have I guess strengths in banking and finance area. Maybe I will say something like that, and hopefully that will that will help. Thank you.
But I was just going to jump in too and say it's also what makes you special. And as you say, you've got this financial background in your master's and you speak other languages, and that makes you incredibly valuable to some firms, probably more than others. And some of the law firms, of course, in Australia a couple of decades ago, they all merged, and most of them, the big firms, merged with UK firms, but Mallison's, King & Wood Mallison's, as it now is, merged with a Chinese firm. So, do some due diligence of which firms might you be able to bring something very special to that other people are not able to bring to it. Ellie, how are we going with questions?
Yep, so Michael Wilson has his hand up. So Michael?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your presentation. It's really good. I'm really interested in sort of banking and finance as a prospective career, and at work I have the opportunity to work with agreements and things like that. So it's a practice that I'm really interested in. And so it's good to know that sort of maths isn't necessarily a requisite, because I definitely don't come from a mathematical background. I was sort of wondering though, what kind of attracted you to a large firm as opposed to a mid-tier or more boutique firm if you want to work in the area?
Thanks, Michael, and great to hear that you have an interest in the area. The short answer is, for me, when I was deciding which firm to apply for, was a lot of it was driven by how I had the experiences that I had had with people from those firms. And it wasn't really driven by whether it's a large firm or small firm, quite frankly. It was driven by, what they told me about what it is that they do on a day-to-day basis, much like we're talking about today, but in a much more informal setting typically, because I wasn't fortunate to have, known too many people who'd worked in too many different firms. And secondly, what was particularly interesting for me was the educational component. I was pretty aware that, through my toe dipping in a couple of law firms before I became a law graduate, as I say, that there was a whole swathe of practical knowledge that I wasn't wasn't up to speed on. In fact, you know, as anybody who's fresh-faced graduate out of university, there's a lot, I think, to learn from a practical perspective, but also, you know, how to actually apply the principles we learned. And I was looking for a firm which was serious and committed about that educational process. And as I say, that's why one of the reasons why I decided to go back to banking finance, in particular at Allens, because the firm as a whole, I think, had a terrific educational program.
Sure, thank you.
Dean, over to you.
Hi, thanks for the speech. I thought it was quite insightful. I have two questions. The first one sort of piggybacks on what you've just mentioned about the training at Allens. And I know I went to the clerkship night, I think last week, and a lot of them said kind of, oh, you'll use maybe 2% of what you use at uni in the commercial life. And I sort of went, oh, you know, it's a bit disheartening, but perhaps I could just ask you about the training that Allens provide and what kind of is the structure of that for a clerk or a grad?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Dean, and I'm glad you attended that evening. Hopefully it was helpful. The short answer is that there is a formalized training program for all young lawyers that we call Cornerstone, that is rolled out for graduates for their first 2 years. And that takes place typically either at a lunchtime or in the afternoon. And it's time carved out of your day, where, you know, the whole firm knows about it, and, you know, it's a good reason for you to attend, even if you have to put something else on hold for a short period of time, usually. And that program is an all-encompassing program that is designed to give law graduates not just the basics of the law in the particular areas that they most commonly work, but also practical advice on how things are handled, so that you can see how law actually works in action, as it were, coupled at the same time. The idea is, you know, obviously you're working full time at the same time, so that you can put those principles into practice. You can actually see those environments and you can have a go behind the wheel yourself. That program has been there for quite some time. Showing my age, it wasn't there when I first started. What we had instead was the banking finance introductory talks, which is still a thing. So banking grads get double the training. They get Cornerstone and then they get specialized banking training. And that course has grown and grown over the years. Originally, I think it was based, as I say, on the Master's Finance Law course that was being taught by a few partners at university. And since then, we've bolstered it so that it really covers almost, you know, most basics of finance, most fundamentals of financing after you bring through that course. In fact, many people, including myself, still go back to the notes that I've taken during that course when I come across area that I haven't looked at for quite some time, because, you know, partners and senior associates and others in the firm have really made a huge effort to put that together. The latest and bit of update on the education training is that we are moving much more into the digital age with on-demand videos. So I created, so one of my areas of specialization is derivatives, which can be quite a complex and daunting thing to talk about. And so I created a very naff little animated video explaining what is a derivative to anyone who's interested. And that's both part of our Cornerstone training, but also actually for anyone else who may not work in banking finance who wants to know a bit about it. So that was the first module that we had within the firm. That was rolled out last year and we're expecting a lot more.
Fantastic, Ewan. Just my second part of the question, so it's great. And I think, well, my second question was, I'm very interested in tax, and I've enjoyed doing that at Monash, and I was wondering what the overlap with your area is in tax, and sort of the deep dive, and if the training is for that as well, the overlap in those two sectors.
Yeah, great question, Dean, because there is a significant overlap between banking finance law and tax. On typical banking finance transactions, there used to be a lot of questions about stamp duty. There still is. There still are some questions, particularly in areas like receivables financing, where it's a real issue. In addition to that, we talk a lot more about interest withholding tax where there are foreign lenders. So as a global corporate law firm, through our alliance with Linklaters. We do a lot of international work, and on typically any large syndicated loan transaction where there's more than one lender, in other words, you might see multiple global or foreign banks who may be subject to interest withholding tax. And I know they have a wonderful education program in their own right, but they also come and do one of the modules in our BAF one as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dean.
Reese, over to you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Given your experience at the Supreme Court, did you ever consider settling on a disputes practice area?
G'day, Reese. Look, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. As I said, I never wanted to be a banking finance lawyer. I always only ever wanted to be a disputes lawyer. And I did spend a year doing insolvency and other disputes work. In the end, I decided that banking finance was actually more suitable for me. It was as big a surprise for me, I think, as it was for anybody else. But that's the short answer.
Thanks.
I have a question, which is, are we getting any women banking and finance lawyers in our group today? We've had every question's been from a guy. Any women there who want to ask you a question?
We've got Matt and Claire to come with questions. So Claire, do you want to go first? And Matt, you can go after that.
Sure. Thanks, you. I just want to say thank you more than anything. So I work full-time in banking and have done so for the last 15 years. Have started studying the JD part-time this year with a view to change careers, with a view actually to get away from banking. But I was keen to come and listen to what you had to say, obviously coming from the industry, and you sort of have made me think that I'll probably keep my options open. And obviously it's a comfort area for me because I understand it. So yeah, really interested to hear what you said. And I suppose just one question for someone who is had more work experience, who works full time. I don't have obviously a lot of time to do sort of extracurricular things or internships. Will that put me at a disadvantage when applying for jobs later on? So yeah, just keen to hear your view on someone who's got more work experience.
Thanks very much, Claire. And look, I think you have more work experience than me in the industry. You worked there for 15 years, just. But it's thanks very much for sharing that. And I highly encourage you to go and keep an open mind and explore. But that doesn't mean, of course, ruling out things that you're comfortable in. That may well be the right answer for you. And I've seen a lot of my colleagues have made a wonderful transition from working as bankers or elsewhere in the banking industry into becoming a banking finance lawyer. In fact, one of my more junior colleagues started off life as a banker at CBA, then came and joined us for a few years, and then decided he wanted to go back to CBA, and last year decided he wanted to come back again. So the road is always open. To answer your question though, Claire, and I think it's an excellent question. The short answer is a good interviewer, in my view, always forms if I can put it this way, it isn't wedded to one set of yes or no questions. You know, a good interviewer shouldn't be asking, does this person fit the exact checklist mold that I'm looking for? They should be asking, would this person be a good fit for the firm or for the practice group? And as I say, everyone has a really different story about where they've come from and their backgrounds. And I think your experience speaks volumes for, you know, the kind of things that people will typically want to learn about when they ask about other extracurricular activities. You know, one of the key questions that come up when people talk about extracurricular activities is how commercial are they and how much they know about the industry. Well, I think you've got that one covered.
Yeah.
So please don't be put off by that.
Okay.
And to harken back to an excellent point that Jennifer made earlier, I think that's something that you can make really work for you, right? It's something that's unique about you and something that's actually a great positive. So you shouldn't feel guilty about that. You shouldn't feel bad about it at all. And, you know, Jennifer's point earlier, I think it's, you know, is absolutely right as well about, you know, women in banking. Our banking finance department, I think, certainly is probably more than 50% women, or maybe even more than 60 or 70% women. at certain points in time during the time that I've been there. So you shouldn't feel that you're out of place at all. And, you know, I completely encourage you to have a go at whatever it is that you like to do, but don't rule banking finance out.
I won't. Thank you, appreciate it.
No, pleasure.
We're on to Matt now. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks you for your just presentation and your time today. Really appreciate it. I think my question is, I'm at the beginning of my JD, and I hear a lot of people say, you know, this is the area, practice area I want to be in. And I think for me, it's kind of hard to identify at this point. So if you could just speak into that when you were in a similar position, because kind of every subject I take, everything seems interesting. But kind of similar to Claire, I work part-time, study full-time, so I don't have a lot of free time. But also, how do you find experiences in kind of certain areas when you are limited time-wise? But also, I just know, you know, clerkships and everything, the pressure that comes with that, and just, yeah, everything to do with that. So yeah, how did you find something that you were passionate about, and just experiences early on? Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. Before I answer that, can I say, Matt and Claire, you know, studying part-time and working full-time, I have so much admiration and respect for you guys. It's one of the final years that I think was teaching in Jennifer's team at senior university. I taught the JD part-time stream, and I know how hard it is for you guys. And I think, you know, it's absolutely amazing. And I'll answer your question this way: that if being able to find the time to have and also have the courage to start a part-time degree while working full-time, you will be able to find the time to be able to do all those other things, and you never need to feel that it's too daunting for you. So for me, as I said, personally, I managed to work it out as I go along. It wasn't something that I planned right at the outset. It was a thesis that had plenty of revisions, and I would reflect on every experience I had. You know, did I enjoy that? Did I not enjoy that? More importantly, why did I enjoy it? Was it a one-off factor, or was it a systemic thing? You know, if I didn't enjoy something, similar questions, right? And I think it's taking that time to reflect. And I think someone mentioned earlier in asking a question, that's a really hard process. I couldn't agree with you more. It's hard, it's painful, it takes a bit of time, but also it helps you grow, I think, as a person, because it makes you at that point realize what it is that's meaningful, but also interesting to you. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's just, as you said, it's that time process. It doesn't just kind of present itself and says, this is it. Rather, you just have to find what you're passionate about. And then, yeah, great. Thank you so much, you.
No worries. We have time for one more. Anastasia would like to ask you something as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So much, and thanks for a great presentation. Sorry about my voice, I've lost it partially. But my question relates to your further study. I was quite interested to listen to that. And I wanted to know, did you feel as though, because I know you mentioned that you did some further educational training when you went back to Allen's, did you feel as though that further study was kind of really critical in sort of forming your kind of legal perspective at the moment? And kind of second question to that was, having done both the masters at Harvard and Cambridge, both, as you mentioned, were quite different courses, but which did you find, and no doubt both would have been quite useful, which out of the two did you find to be kind of more valuable in sort of your outlook on the law currently?
Well, thank you for those very profound questions, Anastasia. So I'll take your first question first. I think that was about whether, you know, I found my time studying overseas being helpful to my practice when I came back. Look, the short answer is yes, but not immediately so. What do I mean by that? The things that I worked, that I studied in, you know, none of them were directly about how to draft a facility loan agreement. It wasn't about how to draft a guarantee. But what I did at Cambridge, it gave me the necessary background to be able to understand why it was that I was drafting those things, and a really much deeper understanding. And it has actually shaped the direction of my practice a fair bit. because as you could tell by some of the examples that I gave earlier, part of my practice, a large part of my practice is like every other finance lawyer, transactional, but also a large part of it now, and a growing part of it, is advisory, and it's regulatory in bent, which has gone quite well with the sort of developments of the last 5 years or so in the banking finance industry. My degree at Cambridge gave me the solid sort of doctrinal basis in order to understand that and to be able to work in that. My time at Harvard, for example, I did the negotiation workshop. That the skills that I learned through that, I put to use literally every single day. Do I think of it as giving me an additional benefit or advantage? I don't think of it, but I think it. If I were to sit down and say, has it made me a better lawyer? I think the answer is inevitably yes. To answer your second question, the Sophie's choice question, Cambridge or Harvard. I'm going to stick with the answer that they were both terrific in their own way, and they were both helpful to me in very, very different ways. When I'm drafting a piece of very complicated advice about whether or not a true sale has happened, or there's like I was last week drafting a piece of advice in relation to whether there's a constructive trust or that there's a unjust enrichment claim. I think my degree and my time doing the modules on those subjects at Cambridge probably it would be more useful. But if I were negotiating a document, or if I were writing a policy paper, or if I were discussing, for example, how to run a multi-jurisdictional deal, a global deal involving particularly my friends and colleagues in the US, my time at Harvard has been absolutely invaluable. And all of that is in addition to the many friendships and great times I've had in both those places. So it's very, very difficult for me to pick. And I hope you're okay with that, Anastasia.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I have to just, tell you a funny story. When I was teaching before I came to Monash, there was a very eminent US law firm that came out to, try to recruit our students. And I remember the managing partner from this New York law firm saying, we just think Australian students are amazing because most of the people in our firm are from Harvard and they don't know any law. And Australian students know stuff about law. It's incredible. So I was quite amused. But the Harvard students, they cottoned on clearly. We have to wrap up now, but it has been such a pleasure. I love your term, how your aim is not to be playing unnecessary Russian roulette in advising clients. I think that's something we should absolutely keep, as a you-ism for teaching in the future, to say we're teaching you not to play unnecessary Russian roulette once you get out into practice. I know the students have been very grateful that you gave up your time today to talk to them about your experience in banking and finance law. I also know that they'll be even more excited to know that you're going to be teaching in this area for us next year, are you not? That is the plan anyway. We're growing Russell. And so those students who are interested in learning more from you, hopefully we will be putting on a course next year where he'll be able to give you further and better particulars about banking and finance law. So from all of us, thank you very much for coming along today.